Today, we're going to be talking about the updated 2022 Daytona 500 entries. Let's go ahead and just jump straight into it. What's going, guys? It's Daniel, and welcome back to our video. Currently, as of right now, 39 cars are completely entered for this year's Daytona 500. And as of right now, it is only expected that maybe we'll see between 39 and 41 cars for this year's Daytona 500. I believe that we are only going to see 40 cars for this year's Daytona 500. I don't think we're going to see a short field for this year's Daytona 500, but I don't think we get any more than 40 entries. There could possibly be a car that goes home, but I think we're only going to have 40 entries for this year's Daytona 500. So let's jump into the drivers as of now that will be competing in this year's Daytona 500. The first driver to talk about is the one car for Trackhouse Racing, and this one we already know. His car is going to be driven by Ross Chastain for 2022. Phil Sturgeon will be the crew chief for him, who crew chief for him at Chip Ganassi Racing in 2021. He'll be returning to work with Ross Chastain in 2022. When I look at Ross Chastain's potential of winning this year's Daytona 500, I think he's got a really, really good chance if he does not really get too aggressive and crazily aggressive. Because if he's over aggressive, he probably will cause a big wreck in this year's Daytona 500. And with the lack of supply of cars right now, you don't want that to happen. But if he could tone down that aggression and show what he's capable of from the time he was at Kaulig Racing when he won a super speed race at Daytona, I think he'd have a really good chance to win the Daytona 500. So I think he will be fast and will be somewhat of a contender for this year's Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is a two-car for Team Penske. We already know this car. This will be driven by Austin Cindric for 2022. He will have Jeremy Bones as his crew chief, work with Brad Keselowski last year. Now Jeremy Bones will also work with Austin Cindric in 2022. Austin Cindric will be a rookie in the Cup Series in 2022, but he's no shy to how good he is as a super speedway racer. He won the 2020 NASCAR Xfinity Series opener at Daytona, 2021, the season opener at Daytona, and has been extremely fast throughout his career in the NASCAR Cup Series or Xfinity Series on super speedway tracks. I think he's definitely an underdog to win super speedway races this year. I think he's going to have a really, really good car throughout this week. If the two car does not run into problems and does not end up in the big one, I think he'll have a very, very strong chance of winning this year's Daytona 500. So I think he's going to be very fast and will be a contender in this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a three-car for Richard Childress Racing. This car in 2022, once again, will be piloted by the 2018 winner of the Daytona 500, Austin Dillon. Austin Dillon is surprisingly really, really good at super speedways. Of course, I believe he'll be working with Justin Alexander this year. But he's a driver I think is very, very good at super speedways. He's a driver I think over the last couple of years, especially with the addition of Tyler Redick, who we'll get into in a little bit. Austin Dillon I think has gotten better in the NASCAR Cup Series. And I think that in 2022, he could have a shot of getting his second Daytona 500 win ever. So I think he's got a really, really good shot winning this year's Daytona 500. And I think he'll have a lot of pace in this year's Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is a four-car for Stuart Haas Racing. Kevin Harvick will continue driving his four-car in 2022. He'll once again be working with Ronnie Childress for the 2022 season. He's had a long-term relationship with Ronnie Childress that started back in 2014. They will continue to work together. Kevin Harvick, of course, has won the Daytona 500. He won it back in 2007. And over the last years, Kevin Harvick has come very, very close to winning the Daytona 500. If Kevin Harvick is still in the hunt and he can make really, really good moves at the end of these 500s, I think Kevin Harvick realistically could be an underdog to win the Daytona 500, or someone that could be a threat to win his second Daytona 500. I think he's got a really, really good shot to win this year's Daytona 500, and he's someone to keep your eyes on for the 2022 Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is the 5-car for Hendrick Motorsports. This car, of course, being piloted by the defending NASCAR Cup Series champion, the 2021 champion, Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson once again worked with Cliff Daniels in 2022 and also left Tyler Bond as a spotter for him for 2022. Kyle Larson, while he's not been historically really, really great at super speedways, the Daytona 500 is a different story, as if you look at his Daytona 500 finishes compared to other super speedway races, he tends to actually run very, very well. And he came very close to winning the 2017 Daytona 500 with Chip Ganassi Racing, but unfortunately what ended up happening to Kyle Larson is, unfortunately, he ran out of gas on the last lap. Had he been able to have enough gas to win the race, I think he could have been a Daytona 500 champion in 2017. But Kyle Larson, no doubt, if he can survive the big one, especially how fast Hendrick cars have been in the Daytona 500, I think he will have a very strong shot to win this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is the 6 car for RFK Racing. There will be a new driver joining this team. Brad Keselowski will be driving the 6 car for RFK Racing in 2022 as a co-owner / driver of the team. TJ Maters will be the spotter for him in 2022, and his crew chief in 2022 is going to be none other than Matt McCall, who is crew chief for Kurt Busch for the last couple of years. Brad Keselowski is a really, really great super speedway racer. However, if you actually look at his races outside of the Daytona 500, he has absolutely struggled in the Daytona 500 and has really struggled at Daytona. While he's won a lot of races at Talladega, he's kind of struggled at winning races at Daytona. But I think that this year he has a really good chance of winning the Daytona 500 because if you look at the Sis car, especially over the last couple of years, this car has ran up front and contended for victories on super speedway tracks. So if Brad Keselowski doesn't run any problems with this new team, he could be a surprise candidate to win this year's Daytona 500. Keep your eyes out for Brad Keselowski. Next entry we're going to talk about is the 7 car for Mbm Motorsports. This some of you already know, Corey LaJoie will be back with his team for 2022. He'll once again be working Ryan Sparks, who he's had a long-term relationship with the last couple of years. He'll have Ryan Sparks as a crew chief once again in 2022. Corey LaJoie, in my opinion, is very underrated on super speedway tracks. And the last time we were at a super speedway, which was a second to last race at the last time we were at Daytona, Corey LaJoie was very, very fast and showed a lot of pace. So I would not be entirely surprised if Corey LaJoie, if he could survive the big one and doesn't run into trouble, I could see Corey LaJoie being an underdog to win this year's Daytona 500. So keep an eye out for Corey LaJoie, so I think he's got a pretty good chance of winning this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is the 8 car for Richard Childress Racing. This already know, Tyler Reddick will be back in the 8 car for 2022. He'll be working with Darrell Neyland, who will be his spotter, and Randall Burnett will be his crew chief once again for 2022. Tyler Reddick has had a very interesting career on super speedways, but I look at his stats at the Daytona 500. His stats in Daytona 500 have not really been impressive. So of all the drivers on this list, I would put Tyler Reddick as one of the least likely to contend for a win at the Daytona 500. But Tyler Reddick could surprise me this year and have a chance to win. If he doesn't run into the big one, he could be an underdog to win this year's Daytona 500. So we're going to have to keep our eyes out on Tyler Reddick because he could surprise a lot of people and contend for this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 9 car for Hendrick Motorsports. We already know who's going to be driving this car. Chase Elliott will be with Hendrick Motorsports pretty much for the rest of his Cup Series career, and will be in this car for the Daytona 500. He'll be working Eddie DeHaan, who will be a spotter for 2022, and he'll also have Alan Gustafson once again as his crew chief in 2022. Chase Elliott has had a hit-or-miss career in the Daytona 500, but he's the driver and has led a lot of laps. And last year's Daytona 500, he came just short of winning the Daytona 500 before the caution came out at the last second due to that big crash that took place, and Michael McDowell stole the victory for him in the Daytona 500. If Chase Elliott does not run into problems and doesn't run into trouble, I think he's got a very good chance of winning the 500. I think he honestly could win the pole for the Daytona 500, but I think Chase Elliott will be a threat to win this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is the 10 car for Stuart Haas Racing. This driver already know, Eric Almirola will be driving a 10 car once again in 2022. But this will be Eric Almirola's potential last opportunity to race in the Daytona 500 as he will be retiring from full-time competition in the Cup Series at the conclusion of the 2022 season. He'll have Drew Blickenserver as his crew chief, and I believe Joel Edmonds will once again be his spotter for him in 2022 as well. Eric Almirola, when it comes to Daytona 500 and super speedway races, Eric Almirola is a really, really good super speedway racer. And in 2018, he was on the verge of winning the Daytona 500 before getting turned by Austin Dillon late in the event. But when I look at Eric Almirola and his chances of winning the 500, I think he's got a pretty good, reasonable shot of winning the Daytona 500. So if he doesn't run into trouble and doesn't run any problems, I think Eric Almirola could win the Daytona 500 in 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is the 11 car for Joe Gibbs Racing. Denny Hamlin, no surprise, will be back in his car for 2022. He's got a multi-year deal with Joe Gibbs Racing and will continue driving his car for 2022. Denny Hamlin, no doubt, is arguably the favorite to win this year's Daytona 500 because Denny Hamlin has won 3 Daytona 500s, and he'll be looking to become only the 3rd driver to win 4 Daytona 500s. Cale Yarborough has 4 currently, and Richard Petty has 7 Daytona 500 victories. Denny Hamlin is looking, like I said, it was very close to winning the 2021 Daytona 500 and becoming the first driver, the only 3rd driver to have 4 wins in the Daytona 500. But unfortunately for Denny Hamlin, he basically pit strategies unfortunately cost him. Denny Hamlin, in my opinion, is the best super speed racer currently in the NASCAR Cup Series, and I think he will be a threat to win the Daytona 500 in 2022. He's going to be the favorite, and I think if he survives the big one, he will be a driver that can win this year's Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is the 12th car for Team Penske. This driver and team we already know, Ryan Blaney, will be back in the 12th for 2022. But he will have a new crew chief in 2022, as he'll be working with Jonathan Haas, who was the crew chief last year for Matt DiBenedetto in the second half of the season, as Todd Gordon is going to be going to work in Series 7 NASCAR radio on the late night shift with Brad Gilly. Ryan Blaney, I think, is a driver that is very underrated, is a really good driver at Super Speedways, and actually my pick to win this year's Daytona 500. Just because of the fact that Ryan Blaney has been extremely incredible in this Daytona, in the races. He won the last time we were here at Daytona and has won a couple races at Talladega. So I think Ryan Blaney is definitely going to be an underdog to win it, but I think Ryan Blaney will be your Daytona 500 champion and one to keep your eyes on in the Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 14 car for Stuart Haas Racing. This one already know, Chase Briscoe will be driving the 14 car once again for Stuart Haas Racing in 2022. Chase Briscoe, in my honest and sincere opinion, he will be a sophomore driver in the Cup Series. But I think he's another driver that I really unfortunately don't think is going to have a chance to win this year's Daytona 500. Just because Chase Briscoe has struggled in Super Speedway races throughout his young NASCAR Cup Series career. I think he's been good in Xfinity Series races on Super Speedways, but when it comes to the Cup Series, he has absolutely struggled. So I do not think that Chase Briscoe is going to realistically have a chance to win this year's Daytona 500. That being said, though, if he can survive the big one and doesn't run into problems, maybe he could be an underdog to win, but I don't think Chase Briscoe will have a shot to win the Daytona 500 in 2022. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 15 car for Rickwell Racing. This was confirmed about a week or two ago. David Reagan will be in the 15 car for Rickwell Racing in 2022. Not just for the Daytona 500, but for multiple races as well. David Reagan has 2 Cup victories, and both of them come on Super Speedways, and including winning the Summer July race in 2011, driving for RFK Racing at the time. David Reagan's also been up front in the past Daytona 500s, actually finished 4th in the 2020 Daytona 500 with Front Row Motorsports. David Reagan definitely is going to be an underdog to win this year's Daytona 500 just because of his statute and his nature. And if the Rickwell cars have a lot of speed, it would not be surprised if David Reagan has a good shot of winning Daytona 500 in 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 16 car for Kaulig Racing. While a driver has not been announced for the 16 car for the 2022 Daytona 500, I believe I know who will be driving the 16 car for 2022. It won't be Noah Gragson because Noah Gragson is competing for another team we'll get into here in just a little bit. I believe that it will be Daniel Hamrick who will be piloting the 16 car for the Daytona 500 with Kaulig Racing. And the reason is because Daniel Hamrick actually was testing the next-gen car at Daytona. And AJ Allmendinger has not overall been a big fan of Super Speedway Racing. Despite being a contender at Super Speedways with Kaulig Racing in the Xfinity Series, he's not overall been a big fan of Super Speedway Racing throughout his career. And I think Daniel Hamrick, who is pretty good at Super Speedways the last couple of years, I think that he will overall be a driver to watch for. And if he makes, again, he's already locked into 500 if he gets into it, but Daniel Hamrick, I believe, will be in the 16 car for this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 17 car for RFK Racing. We already know who's going to be driving this car. Chris Buescher will be driving the number 17 for RFK Racing in 2022. Chris Buescher has a multi-year deal with this organization, and Chris Buescher is pretty good at the Daytona 500. If you look up his statistics, he's a driver that you're going to have to watch for in the 500 this year if he can survive the big one. And not to mention, he's going to have Brad Keselowski work at them, which I think is a big benefit and a big asset to Chris Buescher. And of course, he will have Scott Gray's back with him next year in the number 17 car as a crew chief. But I think if Chris Buescher can do very well, I think he's got a really good chance of winning Daytona 500. I think he will, and I think he will be a contender for this year's Daytona 500. I think he's the one to watch for in the 500 if he can survive the big one. Next entry we're going to talk about is the 18 car for Joe Gibbs Racing. Kyle Busch, no surprise, will be back in this 18 car in 2022. Now, Ben Bayshore will once again crew chief in 2022. He will not crew chief at the LA Clash as he is suspended due to having the 3 missing lug nuts at Phoenix. But he'll have Ben Bayshore back once you get over to Daytona to start the official regular season. Kyle Busch was a driver that, while he's not been absolutely amazing at Super Speedways, he's led, I think, the most laps of anybody, I think, in the Daytona 500 history. And he dominated in 2009 and has come close in the past to winning the Daytona 500. If Kyle Busch can survive and not have any problems like engine issues or getting involved in the big one, I think Kyle Busch realistically could have a very strong chance of winning Daytona 500. So we'll have to keep our eyes on Kyle Busch because he could have a shot of winning the Daytona 500 and finally crossing off the last big event on his bucket list. The next driver we're going to talk about is a 19 car for Joe Gibbs Racing. This one we already know. Mark Truex Jr. will be driving the 19 car for Joe Gibbs Racing in 2022. Now, Mark Truex Jr. is one driver that I really would not keep your eyes on for the Daytona 500, just because realistically, Mark Truex Jr. has not ran amazing in the past in the Daytona 500, but he does have something really good, as he is the driver who finished second in the closest finish in the Daytona 500 history, finishing second by, I think, 1/100th of a second. And when I look at Mark Truex Jr., if he can survive and not run into problems, he could be an underdog to win. However, when I look at Mark Truex Jr., his statistics at the Super Speedways, he hasn't ran very, very well. But he could surprise me this year, and he could have a shot at winning the Daytona 500. So we'll have to see what Mark Truex Jr. does, but I don't think he's going to be a contender, but we'll have to wait and see what happens if he is a contender for the Daytona 500 in 2022. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 20 car for Joe Gibbs Racing. This one's already been confirmed. Krista Bell will be back in the 20 car for 2022. He'll have Adam Stevens as his crew chief, and I believe Stevie Reese will once again be the spotter for him in 2022. Krista Bell, of course, is a driver that unfortunately caused a big one in the Daytona 500 in 2021, 14 laps into the race. But after that race, he actually got way better in Super Speedways, ran a couple of Xfinity Series races on Super Speedway tracks that kind of helped his goals, and ended up nearly having a shot to win the Talladega Super Speedway race. Now, Krista Bell, of course, he's been hit or miss at Daytona in his short NASCAR Cup Series career. That being said, though, if this 20 car could be up front, because the 20 car seems a lot of times run up front in the Daytona 500, I can see Krista Bell having a really realistically good chance of winning the Daytona 500. So keep your eyes out on Krista Bell, because he could be an underdog to win this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 21 car for the Wood brothers. This one will be a new driver that will be driving for the team in 2022. Harrison Byrne will be a rookie in the NASCAR Cup Series as he moves into the 21 car for 2022. He will have a new crew chief jumping up from the Xfinity Series up to the Cup Series in 2022. As Brian Wilson, who's been a longtime crew chief for the Team Penske Xfinity Series program, he is jumping up to the Cup Series to be a crew chief for Harrison Byrne in 2022. Now, Harrison Byrne, a lot of people are not going to be putting too much stock in Harrison Byrne just because he is a rookie in the Cup Series and doesn't have any Cup Series experience. But he did actually have a really impressive run at Talladega in his debut in the number 96 for Gaunt Brothers Racing. And if you actually look up his statistics in the Xfinity Series, he's actually gotten some top fives on Super Speedway tracks, despite him having some issues in 2021. He's a driver that's actually done pretty good at Super Speedway tracks. So I would put your stock into Harrison Byrne as potentially being an underdog to potentially win. And it's technically his only second Cup start. He could be an underdog to win only in a second official Cup start in the Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 20 car, 2 car for Team Penske. This one we already know, Joey Logano will be back in the 22 car once again in 2022. Of course, Joey Logano. What is not to be said about Joey Logano when it comes to Daytona 500? Joey Logano actually has won the 2015 Daytona 500, and he was very close to winning the 2021 Daytona 500 before, unfortunately, he and Brad Keselowski got into each other coming into the last corner. Joey Logano definitely is going to be a favorite just because of how good he has been at Super Speedway tracks, and he was very, very aggressive in the testing, and even though we have a shortage supply of cars, Joey Logano is planning right now to be extremely aggressive. So take that in the socket. Take that for what it's worth. I think Joey Logano will have a lot of pace and a lot of speed, and I think he'll have a very strong chance of winning this year's Daytona 500 if he can survive the big issues. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 23 car for 23XI Racing. Bubba Wallace, no surprise, will be back in this 23 car in 2022. Bubba Wallace actually does have a Cup Series victory at a Super Speedway, albeit it was a rain-shortened victory, but Bubba Wallace picked up his first career victory in 2021 at Talladega with 23XI Racing, and he's going to be getting an addition that we'll talk about here in the later portions of this episode, but Bubba Wallace has actually been historically really good at Super Speedway tracks, and I think realistically he's going to have a very strong possibility of being an underdog to win the Daytona 500. Considering, like I said, how good he's been on Super Speedways and how easy it's come to him, how good he's been on Super Speedways, I think the Bubba Wallace actually has a very strong shot of contending for the overall victory if he can be up front at the end of the day. So, of course, he'll be having his other group work with him in 2022, but I think Bubba Wallace could have a very strong shot of winning the Daytona 500 in 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 24 car for Hendrick Motorsports. Once again, William Byron will be back in the 24 car in 2022. He'll have the same group of pairing that he's had in the past. Redick will be working with him, but he also will have a new spotter in 2022 as Brendan Lyons, who spotted for Ryan Preece in 2021, will be working with him in 2022 as Tabboy goes on to another organization for 2022. William Byron is a driver that I think is really, really good at super speedways and picked up his first career NASCAR Cup Series victory at Daytona in 2020 in the summer race to decide who got into the playoffs. When I look at William Byron, if he can, he's going to probably be fast and qualified. I know last year's Daytona 500 did not really go well. He got back out on track and tried to complete some laps, but I think unfortunately he had to go back behind the wall in the later portions of the race. But if William Byron can get out there and get some laps and be up there at the end of the race, I think he's got a really good realistic chance of winning Daytona 500. So I think he's got a really good shot of getting it done, and keep your eyes on a William Byron of being a contender for winning the Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 27 car for Team Haysbert. This was confirmed this past week at the Daytona test. Jacques Villeneuve is officially confirmed to be running and or attempting to qualify for this year's Daytona 500. This will be the first time that Jacques Villeneuve has attempted to race in the NASCAR Cup Series since 2008 when he attempted to qualify in the number 27 car for Bill Davis Racing for inevitably, unfortunately, crashing out in the qualifying for the Daytona 500. And this will be the first time that Jacques Villeneuve has raced in NASCAR's top 3 divisions, I believe, since 2012 when he drove for Team Penske. Now, Jacques Villeneuve, unlike last time, I don't believe he's going to have any issues in regards to getting into this year's Daytona 500 due to the lack of supply of chain of everything right now. But having a world-class driver like Jacques Villeneuve attempt to qualify for Daytona 500 is absolutely incredible. He said there are 3 races that he's wanted to compete in and contend for victories. The 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Indy 500, which he has won, and of course winning the Daytona 500. And for a guy like Jacques Villeneuve, a world-class caliber driver to come and race in the Daytona 500 is absolutely incredible, and I'm looking forward to him being in the Daytona 500. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 31 car for Kaulig Racing. No surprise here, Judge Haley will be in this 31 car in 2022. He will be joined this year by Matt, I believe it's Trent Owens, who was a crew chief, I think, for Ryan Preece last year. Trent Owens will be jumping into the scene as a crew chief for Justin Haley heading into 2022. Justin Haley, I think, is a driver to really keep your eyes on for this year's Daytona 500 because his only Cup Series victory came at, you guessed it, at Daytona International Speedway on a super speedway track. And I think that Justin Haley, if he can be up front at the end of the race, I think he could have a shot of picking up his second career NASCAR Cup Series victory in the Daytona 500, considering you look at his stats in the NASCAR Xfinity Series. He's ran extremely well in the NASCAR Xfinity Series, picked up 3 or 4 of his victories. All of his victories in the Xfinity Series have come on super speedways, and I think that if they give him a good package, I think that Justin Haley will have a really good shot of winning Daytona 500 in 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 34 car for Front Row Motorsports. No surprise here, Michael McDowell will be in the 34 car once again in 2022. Michael McDowell, of course, the defending Daytona 500 winner and one of the unfortunately worst Daytona 500s in NASCAR history. He ended up having a Cinderella story and picking up his first ever Daytona 500 victory. When I think of Michael McDowell, he's a driver that I think could go back-to-back this year in the Daytona 500. He will have a new crew chief this year in 2022. As Mark Truex Jr.'s former engineer, I don't remember the guy's name who's the engineer, was the engineer for Mark Truex Jr., but he will have a new crew chief in 2022. And of course, Clayton Hughes will once again be the spotter for Michael McDowell in 2022. Realistically, I think that Michael McDowell has a very strong chance at winning the Daytona 500 in 2022 with how good the Ford package has been. I think he realistically will have a very strong chance, and I think he will be fast and contend in this year's Daytona 500 with a lot of pace. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 38 car for Front Row Motorsports. This one's already confirmed. Todd Gillen will be jumping up to the Cup Series in 2022, and he'll be jumping into the number 38 car for Front Row Motorsports. This should not surprise anybody. Todd Gillen had been driving for the last 2 years at Front Row Motorsports in the NASCAR Camping World Truck Series, and multiple sponsors that were sponsoring him in the Truck Series carried over to the Cup Series like Love's. Multiple sponsors sponsored him, will be sponsoring him in the Cup Series in 2022. But Todd Gillen will be jumping up into the deep end as he'll be making technically his debut at the Busch Clash. And when I look at Todd Gillen's opportunity and chances of contending for the 500, I'm going to say it's very, very low. I know his truck stats have been really, really good at super speedway tracks, but you're going to have to be really, really good on cars, and he hasn't really ran any cars. I mean, yes, he's ran a K&N and stuff, and ARCA East back in the day and West back in the day, but that's different than racing in the Cup Series, and he's going to have a little bit of inexperience going into Daytona 500, but he will be able to learn throughout the year as a rookie, and I think he could have a shot. I don't think he's going to win the Rookie of the Year over guys like Austin Cindric or Harrison Byrne, but I think he'll be able to get a lot of learning experiences heading into 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is the 41 car for Stuart Haas Racing. We already know the driver, Colt Custer, will be back in the 41 car in 2022. Of course, Mike Shipp will once again be the crew chief for him in 2022. This should not surprise anybody. Colt Custer, in my opinion, is a driver that's been kind of underwhelming in the first 2 years of his NASCAR Cup Series career. Despite winning a race at Kentucky in 2020 and basically a really great restart for him, he has been very underwhelming in the NASCAR Cup Series. But I will say that Colt Custer could be a surprise candidate to contend for the win of the Daytona 500. If he does not run into problems, it doesn't run into trouble, I can see Colt Custer having a lot of opportunities to go out there and contend for the overall victory in the Daytona 500. So Colt Custer is definitely one to watch. This is definitely the make or break here for me with Colt Custer, because Colt Custer is going into his 3rd year, and he's kind of struggled in the first year as being about a 24th to 25th place driver. But I do think with Prax Colvin coming back this year, I think he could overall be a decent contender for the Daytona 500. So keep your eyes out on Colt Custer to see if he can improve in this year's Daytona 500 and improve in the 2022 NASCAR Cup Series season. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 42 car for Petty GMS Motorsports. This driver already know, Ty Dillon will be driving the 42 car for Petty GMS Motorsports in 2022. He will have Chip Dougherty, or I don't remember the guy's name, but he will have Chip Dougherty as his crew chief in 2022. He's been the guy who's basically been the engineer for the 42 car for Chip Ganassi Racing, but he will be working as a crew chief for Ty Dillon heading into 2022. When I look at Ty Dillon, yes, I know, has not really had a great NASCAR Cup Series career. But Ty Dillon has been pretty good in super speed races, and I think that if he can be up there at the end, because you look at some of the super speed races he's ran, he's been a driver that can really surprise you when it comes to his super speedway statistics. So if he doesn't run any trouble, it doesn't run any problems, I can see Ty Dillon have a very strong chance to contend for the Daytona 500, so we're going to have to wait and see how he does, but Ty Dillon could be an underdog to win this year's Daytona 500 if he can survive. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 43 car for Petty GMS Motorsports. Erik Jones will be back in this car in 2022. This should surprise nobody, considering he's been with the RPM group or the Petty GMS group for the last year or so. Erik Jones, in my opinion, when you look at Erik Jones, of course, he'll have a new crew chief this year. Dave Ellens will be the crew chief for him in 2022. When you look at Erik Jones actually is a very underrated super speed racer. And when you look at the 43 car and the Chevy engines they got, they tend to be very, very fast, and they seem to be very, very fast at Daytona, regardless of what driver gets into the cars. I think that Erik Jones has a very strong chance of contending for the Daytona 500 if he doesn't run into problems. I think Erik Jones could have a very strong and a very good shot of winning this year's Daytona 500 if he's up front at the end of the race. We've seen a car finish runner-up recently, and we could see this 43 car have a shot to win this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 44 car for NY Racing. Now, NY Racing, while this team has not been confirmed the Daytona 500, I think they are going to be potentially the last team that does show up, and apparently they are more than likely that they will show up for this year's Daytona 500, as they do have a next-gen chassis, and there's a lot of chatter behind the scenes that they will show up for this year's Daytona 500. Now, there are 3 drivers who could honestly have a chance of getting into this car. The first one to talk about is the least likely, and that is Matt DiBenedetto. Now, a lot of people would like to see Matt DiBenedetto potentially have at least a one-off start in the NASCAR Cup Series, as he'll be driving full-time in the Truck Series for Rackley War Racing in 2022. But Matty D does not bring sponsorship and funding. If he's going to get into this car, I think that you're going to have sponsorship and funding. The next driver we'll talk about is Rajah Caruth. Yes, you're hearing that right. Rajah Caruth, apparently there have been some cyclings and rumblings that maybe Rajah Caruth, if they show up, could be the driver that gets into this 44 car for the Daytona 500. I think that would be a bad act for him to get into the 44 car in the Cup Series, considering he will not even have a single Xfinity Series start and a start at a bigger track. I don't think that Rajah Caruth be playing it safe to race in the Daytona 500. I think he should have some Xfinity Series experience for even jump up the Cup, and I think that would be a bad decision. To me, if they wanted to be very, very smart, I think they would go with J.J. Yeley, who's driven for the team in the past. J.J. Yeley, of course, has driven for the team, drove for them in 2018, the last time they did race. I think that would be much more smart to get a guy like J.J. Yeley to get in their cars than get a guy like Rajah Caruth. So to me, if I'm NY Racing, if we want our team to be somewhat successful at the beginning, I think we go for J.J. Yeley. So to me, if I'm NY Racing, I go for J.J. Yeley. The next entry we're going to talk about is the 45 car for Kurt Busch. Of course, like I said, Kurt Busch will be driving this 45 car in 2022. Kurt Busch will be working with Billy Scott, who he worked with in the NASCAR Cup Series in 2018. When he worked with them, of course, Billy Scott only has one career NASCAR Cup Series victory, but that came with Kurt Busch. Also, Jason Jarrett will be the spotter for Kurt Busch as well in 2022. Kurt Busch, of course, has won the Daytona 500. He won it back in 2017. And Kurt Busch has been really, really strong throughout his career at super speedways. And you look at the Toyota package, increasing amount of cars that Toyota will have in 2022. Having Kurt Busch join a Toyota plant, I think is really, really excellent. And I do think throughout the year, he's going to be a massive asset to Bubba Wallace throughout the year in the Toyota camp throughout the entire season. And I think that he realistically has a very strong chance of winning this year's Daytona 500 if he can survive the big one and doesn't run into problems. So keep your eyes out on Kurt Busch as he looks to win his second Daytona 500 in his NASCAR Cup Series career and would be his first technical full-time start with the team. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 47 car for JTG Daugherty Racing. This team and driver already know Ricky Stenhouse Jr. will be driving the 47 car for JTG Daugherty Racing in 2022. Brian Petty will be back working with him as a crew chief in 2022, but he will have a new spotter in 2022 as Tabboy, who was a spotter for William Byron, will be working with him in 2022. Ricky Stenhouse Jr. is actually a pretty good super speed racer, as his only 2 Cup Series victories, those coming at Talladega and Daytona in 2017, came, like I said, at super speedways with RFK Racing. When I look at Ricky Stenhouse Jr. as well, he's a driver that tends to be very, very fast, especially on pole qualifying, considering we know that Kroger has sponsored the pole qualifying. Ricky Stenhouse Jr., I think if he does not be too aggressive and doesn't act absolutely crazy, I think that Ricky Stenhouse Jr. realistically could have a pretty strong chance of contending for the Daytona 500 victory if he doesn't run into problems. So keep your eyes on Ricky Stenhouse Jr. I think he's got a realistic chance of winning the Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 48 car for Hendrick Motorsports. This one's already confirmed. Alex Bowman will be back in the 48 car in 2022 with the whole group. He's had great eyes will be working with him, and I think Kevin Hamill will be the spotter for him again in 2022, but I'm not entirely sure if he's returning to work with Alex Bowman in 2022. Alex Bowman has been pretty hit or miss on super speedways. At one time, you'll see him up front contending for the win, and the other hand, you'll see him end up being in a big crash or a big one and doesn't do very, very well. So I'm not leaning toward him having a good run in the Daytona 500. I think he'll qualify very, very well, as he did win the pole, I believe, for the last year's Daytona 500 in the 48 car. But I don't think that he will be a driver that will contend for the 500. I think he's unfortunately going to get caught up in a big wreck and a crash. I do think he'll have a good year in the Cup Series, but I don't think that Alex Bowman will have a chance to contend for the overall victory in the Daytona 500. So keep an eye on Alex Bowman to see if he could have a chance to contend for the Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 51 car for Rick Ware Racing. This one's already confirmed. Cody Ware will be driving the 51 car on a full-time basis in 2022. Cody Ware's actually got a pretty decent super speedway package, and we were expecting that this was going to happen, that Cody Ware was going to be in the 51 car, considering he is the son of Rick Ware. This does not surprise me. He is in the 51 car in 2022. When I look at Cody Ware's opportunity potential to win the Daytona 500, I'm going to say it's very, very unlikely because the Rick Ware cars have not always been up front, and Cody Ware's been hit or miss at super speedways. That being said, though, I can see this team having a really, really strong finish at the end of the day because there are going to be some big wrecks that are going to happen, and there are issues that are going to take place for Cody Ware. So we'll have to keep our eyes on to see what Cody Ware can do, but he will be in this 51 car full-time in 2022, especially in the Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 62 car for Mbm Motorsports. This one's already been confirmed. Noah Gragson will be driving the 62 car for Mbm Motorsports in this year's Daytona 500. Again, if more than 40 cars show up, he'll have to qualify in, but I think regardless, this team would be able to qualify in. Noah Gragson is a very, very solid super speed racer. He does have a win here at Daytona in the NASCAR Xfinity Series in 2020 and has been very, very fast on super speedway tracks. But one thing that is a little bit of his Achilles heel is his over-aggressiveness on the track. And that's one thing that he will have to tone down for 2022, especially for the 500. He'll have to tone down that aggression. That being said, though, he will have a lot of experience with college racing in the Cup Series, but I think it's good to see that he'll be with Mbm Motorsports. And if he for sure makes the 500, I think he's an underdog to win the 500 in 2022. The next entry we're going to talk about is a 66 car for Mbm Motorsports. This one's already confirmed. Timmy Hill will be driving a 66 car for 2022 in the Daytona 500. We're expecting to see Borisset as the road course specialist for the team in 2022, but Timmy Hill will be in the 66 car at least for the Daytona 500. This should not surprise anybody. He will be attempting a triple as he'll be driving his own truck, and then he'll be driving the Xfinity Series 66, and it will be in the 66 car for Mbm Motorsports. Timmy Hill is actually a pretty solid super speed racer. You look up his statistics in the Xfinity Series and even the Cup Series, he actually has some pretty decent statistics on super speedway tracks. So I think if Timmy Hill cannot run into problems and run into issues, he could be an underdog to win the 500. Of course, he'll have to make the show because they are an open team, but like I mentioned, I don't think we're going to get any more than 40 cars for this year's Daytona 500. So Timmy Hill will be in the 66 for this year's Daytona 500. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 77 car for Mbm Motorsports. While the entry and official name of the driver who will be in the 77 for the Daytona 500 has not been confirmed, the expected driver who will be in the 77 for the Daytona 500 is going to be expected to be Landon Cassill. Landon Cassill just this past week tested at Daytona for the Daytona 500. We know that Josh Bliggett will be in the 77 car for 25 races here. That was confirmed this past week. Just confirmed this a day or two ago that Josh Bliggett will be in the 77 car. But Landon Cassill, I think, will be in the 77 car. Of course, he is a Spire client. Plus, Landon Cassill has a lot of experience at Super Speedways and has ran very well at Super Speedways. And he'll be in this car for multiple races this year, according to reports. So I think that Landon Cassill will be the driver of the 77 car for the Daytona 500 with Mbm Motorsports. Next entry we're going to talk about is a 78 car for Live Fast Motorsports. This one's already confirmed. Mccloud will be in the 78 car for Live Fast Motorsports in 2022 for most races. Now, he won't be in his car for every single race, but he will for sure be in his car for the Daytona 500. They believe they're getting a little bit more of a technical partnership with SHR heading into this year. Not as big a Rick Ware Racing, but I believe the Mccloud team will be getting a little more of some upgrades for 2022. What I think of Mccloud's realistic chances of winning Daytona 500, I don't think he's going to have a chance to win it. But I think Mccloud could be a driver that could get a pretty decent finish out of the day, especially with the craziness, because Mccloud is a driver that can keep his equipment together, and especially with the lack of cars, you're going to have to keep your equipment together. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but we know that Mccloud will be in the 78 car in 2022 for the 500. And the final entry we're talking about is a 99 car for Trackhouse Racing. This one's already confirmed. Daniel Suarez will be in the 99 car for this team once again in 2022. Daniel Suarez, in my opinion, is a decent super speed racer, but not an amazing super speed racer. When I look at Daniel Suarez's opportunity to win the Daytona 500 with the Trackhouse Racing Group, I think that it's potentially going to happen. Apparently, they have had a lot more speed in this year's super speed package than they've had. Daniel Suarez said he's been very, very happy with the super speed package. And when you look at Daniel Suarez and how good of a driver he is, especially at super speed races, he's decent. He's a driver that's run up front in the past, and I think that if Trackhouse Racing can give them really, really strong equipment, I could see him having a very strong, realistic opportunity to contend. So we'll have to wait and see what happens to Daniel Suarez heading into 2022. So that is all the confirmed entries and potential entries that will show up for this year's Daytona 500. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. Current case Sean, be notified when a video does go live on my channel. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and support me on Patreon as well. Let's schedule over that and comment your thoughts on today's video. Do you think we'll get more than 40 entries for this year's Daytona 500, or do you think we'll get less for Daytona 500 and only have 39 cars? Let me know in the comments below. The off season is closing in. We're only 33 days from the Daytona 500, and we're also only 19 days from the start of the season. So we're very, very close to Daytona 500. There's a lot of content on the way for 2022. We're just getting this year started. But anyway, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's video, and I'll see you guys next time for some more great and awesome NASCAR and other motorsports content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.